All right, we're going to go ahead and get started.
All right, everybody like Matt's section. Let's hear a round of applause. That was great, Matt.
All right. Somebody pour me a scotch.
And Arthur, you got recording going?
Yeah. All right, just a second. All right.
You're comfortable. You do long day? This is a different type of, I don't know if I should be lecturing or lap dancing.
I didn't bring enough singles, Matt. No, I see the dog side.
We'll go with the locked up option.
Everybody caffeinated, ready to go? All right, well, welcome, and thanks again to the Schwartau family for hosting us all here. I mean, what a great venue in order to bring a bunch of us together. My experience at InfoWarCon goes back over 21 years, which is kind of scary when you think about it, right? It's legally old enough to drink, and skipped a few years in between. But I've been probably at just about every one that's been held, I think, at this point, and spoken at most of them. And for a couple of years, Wynn and I actually combined InfoWarCon with my TRC-Con, which was really interesting because we got the terrorism folks talking with the information warfare folks, and you probably remember that session when we had General Downing and guys like that we were learning a lot of lessons on both sides of the equation. I give a lot of presentations. I mean, probably like Wynn, in the prior 30 days, the next 30 days, I'll speak in front of 20 audiences. Those tend to be very corporate presentations. I'm presenting to boards of directors and talking about risk and talking about risk management. But for me, InfoWarCon was always something beyond that. It was kind of pushing us to that kind of next level of discussion and thinking about these issues. And so to kick this off, what I decided to do is something completely different. You notice the viewfinder, my slide presentation is all photos. And really for me, what it is basically to set up a couple of markers with regards to what I think we need to be talking about, not only at this event, but at future events, in order for this to be successful, as well as throw down a couple of markers, with regards to where we've been and where we're going. So with that, we'll tune into the Viewmaster. The first thing I want to recall is, we were talking about these issues over 20 years ago, and when we were right? I mean, there was definitely the emergence of conflict in this space, our critical dependencies on infrastructure that was inherently dependent on the use of information technology and increasingly utilized by information technology. Want to get scared? Talk to Chris. It's great to see Chris here. But, I was amazed the other day when my team showed me the SCADA control system for one of our large oil customers. And I was used to Chris hacking in the command line into these SCADA systems, and they brought up a nice point-and-click display. They had me worried that they were going to shut off a refinery valve just by an errant mouse click, right? So not only have we adopted these technologies, but we've adopted them in full scope. This will be familiar to many folks. Presented this at InfoWarCon 20 years ago. Presented it subsequently with Sweden. So I just thought it'd be interesting to think, well, where did we see targets, across this matrix? And of course, I think we can check all the boxes at this point, right? Which is kind of interesting. We've seen the physical on physical, obviously, the physical on digital, the digital on physical, with things like Stuxnet, and then of course the digital on digital we were seeing the emergence of 20 years ago. So interesting to say, we thought about how our infrastructure is going to be attacked in the future, and put this real simple 4-cell matrix together that Neil Pollard and Brian Houghton and I did for our infamous toaster paper. I was told I couldn't go through the session without mentioning the toaster paper. If you want to go back and read it, we talk about the Internet of Things, we talk about active defense, we talk about the emergence of these issues in these 4 quadrants. Here's the other one. 20 years ago, we were begging for the attention of the policymakers. We have their attention now. We have to figure out what to do with it. I don't know if you follow any of the legislative activity that's taking place in the US, et cetera. We have the full attention of the folks, not only in the political domain and the business domain. In the past 3 years, I've briefed more boards of directors than I did in the prior 15 years combined. Right? So we have their attention. I think there's a key mission there that now that we have the attention, what is the message that we want to convey? We don't want to go back in time and convey the message we were conveying 20 years ago. We need to figure out what are the new things that are important, and not only important right now, but what is going to be important in the next 5 to 10 years. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. I think we can all agree there's been a kind of a fundamental failure in security, and not security at the practitioner level. I would say security at the management level. And the reason why is we've kind of accepted this model as secure, right? Technically, that chain is held together, right? But as if you can't see, just a zip tie holds 2 links together. And that's kind of the model that has been allowed to perpetrate, at least, you know, and I'm doing much more on the commercial side, in the commercial sense, as we focused on things like compliance-based security and standards-based security, and allowed it to be kind of a checkbox approach. Well, the box can be checked, but this gate is locked, but it's not anywhere near secure. And there's going to be a lot that we need to discuss to kind of address some of those failures that have been instituted over the course of time. Not advancing. So this is another one I wanted to address as well. We were talking about information terrorism and things of those sorts going back. I mean, even in Wynn's first book, we're talking about cyber terrorism. But I really feel like in this domain, we're starting to enter into the age of asymmetric threats, right? Where there are going to be individuals that are bad actors that are that have a disproportionate power to have an impact on us through their attacks. If you followed the story of the attack against Sony, from what I've read in the open sources, literally the team had to leave North Korea because they didn't have the infrastructure. They went to a hotel and then they downloaded all the tools and technologies that they needed to perpetrate that attack, right? So kind of a rogue nation, state-sponsored type of attack. The terrorist organizations have certainly ventured into the cyber domain for propaganda, recruitment. We know that there's interest in engaging in attacks. It's just a matter of time. So I want to make sure as we focus on these, you know, state-sponsored attack issues, that we also start thinking about the asymmetric aspects of it. And I know there's several folks that'll be speaking to that over the course of 2 days, but I think it's important to remember the fact that we have a lot of threat actors out there that are kind of super empowered to engage in attacks. We also have a huge strengthening of capability in kind of the organized crime space. Any of the folks that spend time studying some of the Russian organized crime, some of the Eastern European, they are formally associated, affiliated with, and protected by traditional organized crime, which is formally associated and protected by the state security apparatus. Makes for interesting kind of hyper criminals that can exist out there. I first wrote a paper in 1999 about trying to utilize commercial, almost kind of mercenary teams in support of cyber conflict. But I can tell you now, just based on things I've witnessed over the past 12 to 18 months, the mercenary / private contractor angle as it relates to engaging in offensive information warfare is here. We're going to have to be addressing that reality in the very near term. So it's no longer just a white paper, no longer a joke. That logo with the, if you don't recognize it, the black water instead of the paw, we put a computer in there and printed those t-shirts for DEF CON 4 years ago. And we put the word "who hacks wins," right? So a play on the "who dares wins." And then put a website that we just lured people to that was called Information Outcomes, which was a play on Executive Outcomes, the old mercenary outfit. It was a joke, but the reality is we're going to have these very financially motivated, maybe affiliated with states, maybe not, kind of mercenary type actors that are going to get very active in the computer defense domain. And so we need to be thinking about the implications of what, from my perspective, is kind of a new actor. If you have very wealthy foreign governments that maybe are closely aligned with some of our countries that want to hire specialized skill sets to engage in offensive attacks, how are we going to deal with that reality? Hear a lot about the Internet of Things, and obviously that's a growing security concern. But I'm also very curious and interested in kind of the sky of things. If we look at what's been happening, and I know this is something that you guys covered last year as well, with the emergence of all of the things that we're just allowing into the sky, the amateur drone initiatives, the fact that we can have a helicopter or a whatever, I forget what the solo copter land on the lawn of the congressional lawn in DC. Drones being used for delivery, drone platforms being used by governments. I think that becomes a very curious, area from my perspective, that we're going to have all of these things flying above us in what is already, you could argue, a fairly crowded space. Another one with regards to our conception of time. I got asked 2 years ago to go and red team the chairman of the Joint Chiefs strategy for 2020. And it was a great honor. There were 8 of us on the red team. And the first issue that I raised was, why are we only thinking about 2020? Which at the time was, 8 years away. When we have adversaries that are thinking in a much longer time span. I think one of our great failings in this space, and I think one of the highest value propositions of InfoWarCon, is that this should be the space that we're projecting out. Thinking about the future, thinking about some of the grand strategy implications, because for certain our attackers are. When I'm asked most often about what I'm concerned with in cybersecurity right now the most, I don't talk about intellectual property theft. I don't talk about DDoS. I talk about a concept I call strategic penetration for future exploitation. And the best way to explain that is to say, prior to World War II, that you're the president of the United States, and somebody comes to you and says, we've got this great plan. We're going to clandestinely install explosives in the ball bearing plants of the Germans. And we can do it without attribution. You don't ever have to push the button. But if we do wind up in conflict with them, being able to push that button is going to be, hugely strategically advantageous to diminish that capability in their war-making machine. Do you say yes? How many people say yes? You raise your hands.
What year is it?
Yeah. All right, we'll just say prior to conflict in World War II.
Well, we sold Saddam HP printers that had extra functionality.
So similar type concept. So the realist in me, of course, says yes. I can do it. I don't ever have to push it, so I don't have to blow things up. I can do it without attribution. It will give me advantage in the future if I need it. You have to think about the adversaries attacking our critical infrastructure in that same context. Do the Chinese have the intent to take down a power grid in the United States right now?
Do they have the intent or the capability?
Do they have the intent? Do they have the intent right now to take down? No, right? Economic interdependence, fear of escalation, fear of global condemnation. There's all these kind of classical deterrents that are in place. The Chinese can envision, though, a time in the future, if we talk about time-shifting intent now, right? They can envision a time in the future where they might want to take down a power grid over a regional security issue, over an economic security issue, over just some sort of traditional conflict. So if you put yourself in the perspective of that time-shifted intent saying, hey, I might want to do this, what do you need to be doing right now? Oh yeah, you need to be owning that critical infrastructure, right? So when I think about security threats and security risks in this concept of time-shifted intent, we need to be thinking about, if our adversaries are considering that they might need to take critical infrastructure down 5 or 10 years from now, what do they need to be doing? And that should be guiding some of our stuff. And then on the corollary, what do we need to be doing over the next 8, 10, 20 years in this space? And I think we did a really good job of that 20 years ago, of projecting forward. I don't think we do as good a job of it today because we're so overwhelmed by history catching up with us. I'm going to throw this up here. this is a difficult space for me to talk to in the kind of open source sense, but I'll just say more Russia, less China, right? With regards to what we should be thinking about. There's been an incredible level of attention paid to China-sponsored activities. A lot of that surrounding intellectual property theft. I've gone on the record in other events saying that I think the intellectual property theft is a short-term problem, right? You can only steal so much before you start to achieve some sort of parity where the money that you spend in stealing the incremental improvement in IP is less valuable to you than the money that you can spend on innovation in your own country. We're already starting to see that shift within China with venture funds being stood up, focused on specific industries, et cetera. Now they've got the backbone of all the IP that they've previously stolen from us, but it doesn't mean that this is going to be as widespread an issue. I also think it gives them an opportunity to acquiesce in the diplomatic space on some issues, and that's one area where they can start to diminish their activity, claim to be cracking down on others. The other thing is that with the Chinese sponsored attacks, it again is more strategic, more overt. Whereas the Russian stuff to me is much more visceral. Even just the attitudes that are out there with the resurgence of some of the nationalist movements, so there's just a much more visceral, clandestine feel to it. So it's one of those things that I worry about a lot more now. And in talking with a lot of my colleagues, both in and out of government, I've been posing this question for the past year, and they've all been weighting their concerns over Russia as being greater than those over China. This is what I like to throw out. I'm a huge OODA loop advocate, as you'll see later. But I used this slide actually with a bunch of Marines a couple of years ago. I resurfaced it. It's the only non-original slide except for the matrix in here. Thinking about the fact that we're going to have to be automating a lot of these technologies, and that OODA loop is going to get compressed pretty significantly, and is also going to have to happen at machine speed, right? So I'd love to see and hear some discussion on kind of how do we deal with that? How do we turn over aspects of what are kind of national defense initiatives to things that are going to have to operate within this compressed OODA loop? This is I almost posted this to Facebook and said, yes, I did do that. Winter is coming. I do feel like for multiple reasons that we are going to have some critical infrastructure failures associated with cyber attacks. I'm not a doomsday scenario, folks, where and people laughed about this earlier. I don't believe we're going to reach the state where it's going to be such a catastrophic failure that we're going to be eating our neighbors' children. But I do feel that it's going to be fairly disruptive. And one, for multiple reasons. There's so many entities playing around in critical infrastructures right now that there just could be some inadvertent failure, right? Call it the equivalent of, a million monkeys and a million keyboards will allegedly type the great works of Shakespeare over time, just based on the randomness of sequences. Well, a million hackers, in the infrastructure today eventually do something that causes some sort of cascading failure that we're not prepared for. The other aspect of this is I think that because we've got the attention now of these political leaders and they've seen, we've had Stuxnet and we've seen attacks like that, I think it's just going to be too attractive not to try it, right? There's that huge appeal of being able to wage that first, even if it's just a micro war, that first conflict in cyberspace is just going to become too appealing, where you're going to have entities that are going to try it. They're going to try and limit the impact. They might try and do it anonymously without attribution, although that hasn't been working out well for folks recently. But I do feel that we will see some sort of isolated infrastructure failure as a result of cyber conflict here in the next, let's call it the next 5 years. This is another one that's a pet peeve of mine. We've had the active
they don't have to post it. So they've got it and they're using it.
Yeah, so I'm putting kind of a much more U.S. Western-centric perspective on this right now.
But it exists anyway.
It exists out there, and we have capabilities that exist. I think that we just don't utilize them to the extent that we should. We get bogged down in, what's that? Or we don't talk about them. Well, if they were getting utilized, I think we'd see a lot less bad things happening out there in the net. But I think that's one area where, you know, I'd love to see a resurgence of the real debate. What does it mean to take a criminal botnet down with, you know, the U.S.-based authorities on systems that are hosted overseas that we know are doing bad things? And can we declare something where it's, you know, the thing is getting taken down in 3 days instead of 3 years, right? It's hard to declare success when you already have millions of victims and a ton of intellectual property stolen. And I think we have analogies that we can apply with regards to boarding of vessels in piracy situations and things of that sort that, you know, can equally apply in the cyber domain. We just haven't had a real active debate about that. Yes, sir.
The challenge in this business is that it takes time, space, and distance to do a physical boarding ship. All this stuff can happen.
Yep.
Before we come back and do something. How would you close it?
I think, you know, there are indicators. If you talk with any of the, and again, I'm taking a very U.S.-centric approach because I tend to work with U.S. companies. The carriers are seeing a lot of activity that are early indicators. There are intelligence firms. I mean, JD and I worked together on one where we saw lots of early indicators with regards to emerging botnets that you could even associate with particular actors, so you knew what they were trying to do, what they were going after. That information being fed into a kind of real active defense. And in our toaster paper, we talked about that 20 years ago. We wanted to create what we called digital integrated response teams, DIRT teams. Had a cool name too. Where that can be fed in, and somebody can, in the cyber domain, go and check out the command and control infrastructure, maybe recapture that command and control infrastructure. Yes, it might be owned by a private entity in an international area. We have to be willing to accept that others might do that to us if that infrastructure gets stood up in our space. But you don't try and harm, if it's owned by another entity, not on some sort of bulletproof hosting provider. You have to be very careful with regards to not impacting that box, but it's already being used for purposes that are outside the original owner's intent. But yeah.
So you mentioned you have to be careful about what you do to that box.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the problem with the debate. You know, the concern is that there's always a law that is going to stop you from being able to defend yourself in this case. We'll talk about it this afternoon.
Great.
But I think that's one of the areas where the real concern exists. There's always it's the province of government.
Sure. And I don't think that this needs to be, in my opinion, a government activity.
I agree.
Right. I'm not saying we need to commercialize this or that companies need to be defending themselves. I think we need to address it at the government level. Yeah, I've got another. This is Spark. Great.
Yeah, just as a thought, I know we got this one lawyer. But
Where's she? I didn't see her yet.
And the Geneva Accords, the inherent right to self-defense. If there's an attack that's feeling or so egregious or feeling such a level of intellectual property, if that corporation actually responded by hiring a hitman to go slack somebody, that might actually be proportional because it was the continued existence of that corporation, of that person, that was at risk, and they responded in a way to preserve their continued existence.
With respect to everybody, this is the topic when at beer o'clock, if you look at the schedule, this afternoon, we get to really get into this mess. And with all of the full spectrum of, that's why we're doing it as a debate, and that's the courtesy of Mr. Wilcox.
Yep. No, absolutely. And as again, these slides are kind of the things that I'm hoping that we're going to talk about and be thinking about, at least coming out of this. So I'm glad that I have hit on at least a couple of touch points. This one I just couldn't resist because it's InfoWarCon, and we're going to talk about UFOs and all sorts of other fun stuff as well. We talk about information overload and, the kind of the future shock and the kids. being attached to their phones. We haven't seen anything yet. I mean, I don't know if you're following what's happening with the augmented reality and virtual reality and all that sort of stuff, but I mean, the next 10 years are going to be massive technological advancements. They're going to be very interesting to watch. And then the last slide, just to prove that I'm not always a pessimist, I am encouraged by some of the things that are being invested in on the defense side of the equation as well, right? Not that they're going to provide any near-term value, but again, when you start to look at 3 to 5 years out, there's some very interesting things that are being done with behavioral analytics and machine learning and swarming technology, AI, things of that sort. So there is hope. I don't want to be the pessimist in the room. I have caught myself being, you were there at the Atlantic Council where I was, the only optimist around the table, because I really do feel like we'll be empowered to make things better over time. It's just going to take some work to get there. That's all I have. Yes.
Does anybody think of all these cyber things as being part of the greater strategy? Or because all I've heard has been cyber for cyber's sake.
Yeah.
Has anybody thought of combining it with other means?
There's been discussions about that.
Okay.
And that was kind of one of the key things when we looked at the chairman's strategy. Obviously, there was a cyber component, so there's some integration happening there. But does the cyber strategy for the U.S. need to be a standalone cyber strategy, or should it be integrated as a part of a larger grand strategy?
Right.
And I think we do grand strategy very poorly right now, and part of that might be because we intentionally, break things into chunks that maybe should be integrated together. So.
David Michelle, if anyone wants it, I'll give you admin. I've got the user group on LinkedIn. I'm happy for you to admin it and anyone join and discuss this continually. If that's of use to you, it's free.
Yes.
Without getting into anything classified or anything like that, I just would like your opinion. You mentioned that you felt Russia was more dangerous than China in the hacking game.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could just elaborate on that, the visceral versus the careful strategic.
Yeah, I think for me, there's obviously great capability there. Again, they're much more kind of a mirror image, to us with regards to cyber operations, and that it's much more clandestine, classified. Obviously, the integration and kind of corruption issues that they have, not only at the nation state, but within the security apparatus is a huge concern. But then the other metric there for me, and it's a real touch point, is just studying the resurgence of kind of the nationalist movement there, where we are really being demonized. And Joel, I hope you'll speak to this today. It's one of the reasons I put it in there. From a PSYOPs perspective, they are running a very effective PSYOPs campaign against their internal population. And it was something that I was watching.
Are you talking about Russia or China?
Russia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because honestly, what you just said, you can interchange.
You can swap, yeah. But I think, I don't know, and we can talk about this afternoon. The stuff that I see on the China side is, not as visceral, not as kind of warmongering as we see in the Russia side. And it's an area I've been tracking that it really struck home for me a few months ago. I have a person I went to college with here in the United States who's Russian, who we've interacted with and maintained connectivity over email and Facebook. And he came online on Facebook one night and said, do you agree with these sanctions that the Obama administration has instituted? And I was like, why are we having this discussion? Like, how are you? How are the kids type stuff? And he's like, these are criminal sanctions, and you've declared war on my children, so now I'm declaring war on your children. And he said, my children will be stronger than your children because yours are being raised by homosexual couples and mine are being raised by real families. And just went on to engage in it. And I looked at it, so, if somebody that's this, Western educated, lots of Western friends is now willing to go on Facebook and start, attacking people verbally based on some of this activity, there's got to be something much deeper. And this is your area of expertise more than mine, but it certainly has struck me that there's a kind of reinforcing, much more, demonizing factor that exists there.
If I could touch on this for just a second, and I won't talk about this during my presentation tomorrow. One of my jobs was going to China and talking about cyber warfare, and it struck me when I was sitting there, and so I talked to them about Chinese capabilities in cyber war, and I said, I said, you guys hack, we break into your systems. you break into our systems. We spy on you and you spy on us. But, and this is what I told the Chinese seniors. I said, you don't scare me as much as Russia does, because you get caught all the time. And
And they don't mind getting caught. I
And-
mean, that's.
And since then, though, I've amended that a little bit, because in my mind, I think there's 3 stages of hackers. There's the script kiddies that go in and they make a lot of noise and they change things and they get caught. Then you got the people who are pretty good, and they get in there and they can make up code on the fly. And those are the ones that we mostly worry about. Then you got the really good people that you never hear them, you never see them, but they probably do the most damage to us because of their surgical capabilities. And so I won't tell that to the Chinese, but that's just something that I've developed through multiple trips to China and Russia. And Tim Thomas is here, and he can probably speak a lot to that also. I couldn't see you, Tim. Okay. So he's another good expert.
Richard.
Yeah, a couple points, orthogonally speaking. One is there's a meta communication in your presentation, which is that every single slide, I believe, every single one, had an image from science fiction, one way or
Well,
another.
that's my personal bias.
No, it's more than that. My last talk at DEF CON last year was fiction is the only way to tell the truth, like the national security state. And there's a lot of hits on YouTube. But that has been my experience. Fiction is the only way you can be safe about certain things that you can disclose. And the result is that the impact on the mind of society of fiction and nonfiction is more than blurred. We live in a hyper-real environment. And to keep the conversation and discourse clear, sometimes that distinction is helpfully made in order to have people understand what's really happening. Because in my experience, even with the most sophisticated people, because seeing films is identical to experiencing reality in terms of how our memories and brains parse it. And people don't realize, like Anthony Scalia citing Jack Bauer as case law, that he really did, a fictional character. The other thing is, and I have to throw this in because I'm half crazy, is that you mentioned UFOs, and the laughter is always indicative of how effective the response has been from the 50s on. And I have to say, if anybody is interested in going beyond what has been done to the mind of society on that important subject, this book is called UFOs in Government, a Historical Inquiry. My name is on the cover because I was part of a team that worked for 5 years after 50 years of document gathering, literally over half a century by moles who have dug out everything they possibly could. And what we document in this book, the historical inquiry focuses on the government, not on the speculative fly-by-night guesses about what the phenomenon is, but on the government responding to what they knew was a real phenomenon from the 40s on, and why they set policies in light of national security in the 50s and maintained them into the 80s, despite the intermittent impact on the mind of society by the phenomenon itself, which has been distorted. And cover and deception uses ridicule and derision and misdirection routinely in order to confuse people as to what it was about. But that was an intentional decision. We have the documents here from the CIA and Air Force in the 50s, which established that policy. So if anybody would like to look at this, it's in over. The book is recognized as the only one legitimately belonging in university libraries. It's in over 50 now, because it's a rigorous historical analysis. And I just throw that out because I understand that laughter often does attend even the mention of the subject, but we've known the phenomenon is real and have been trying to deal with what it is, what it represents, and we don't know yet.
Sure. We'll do one more question, then to stay on schedule.
I don't have a book to sell, but.
Oh,
We're coming tomorrow.
Everybody knows that.
the first
You
thing.
mentioned some of the difficulties with regard to the horizoning, talking about 8 years out. I know that in the Navy, we used to do things trying to project out 25 years, 50 years, and things like that. Have we gone back and taken a look at the effectiveness of those long-range projections? Because when you look at something as simple as cell phones, 7 years ago, the most common operating system was Symbian. They sold more Microsoft Windows CE phones than Apple, and there were 0 Android phones. So with a tectonic shift in that short period of time and the acceleration of the rate of change, can we really do a good job of projecting in the cyber world beyond maybe only 1 or 2 generations, which is at most 3 years?
Yeah. I think we can at least try. I mean, I'm willing to bet that a lot of those projections identified the importance that mobile devices were going to play and the capabilities that would be introduced to mobile devices. They're definitely not going to get the platform right and things of that sort. But I think we're at least obligated to try. And it's one of those things where you're obviously not going to be right all the time, but by forcing yourself through that function and thinking about those issues, the question I always ask is, if we could go back in time 20 years, what would we say differently at InfoWarCon? So if we project out 20 years, what would we be saying now? What would be our regrets and stuff that we should have covered or addressed or pushed on or thought
Or let's
about?
go back and look at what we said back then, scorekeep, and then we can see, are we on the right track?
I've started digging through the archives for sure. I mean, the folks that are friends on Facebook have seen me then posting some stuff from the original. I think I was at InfoWarCon 2 with the first
Staff
one.
has the entire library. I gave it to
Does he have it? Okay.
6 years ago.
Yeah.
That's everything.
That's everything.
You